Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East. U.S. forces announced that 2 soldiers were killed and a third was injured when their convoy came under attack yesterday in northern Iraq. Meanwhile, 2 more Americans were wounded this morning when a bomb exploded on a street near southern Baghdad. Afterwards, U.S. forces began an intense campaign attacking groups and members who they say are behind the attacks against them in many Iraqi areas. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, denied that his country will withdraw its forces from Iraq anytime soon, despite the attacks against the U.S. and coalition forces. Rumsfeld's statements came while he was visiting Japan, announcing that the Iraqi forces will be confirmed by the end of the year. Rumsfeld met with Japan's Prime Minister to discuss, in addition to the issue of Iraq, North Korea, and the security in the region. The French Foreign Minister, Dominique de Villepin, said that France is against helping Iraq unless authority is given back to the Iraqis. De Villepin said that according to what he sees today, the military cooperation based on security has reached its limit. He said what is needed now is a political, diplomatic solution. He also said that this cannot happen without international unity. De Villepin said that the war was justified as a war against terror, while terrorism did not exist in Iraq before the war. Today, terrorism has increased in Iraq and the whole region. The U.S. government has decided to reopen its embassy in the Saudi capital of Riyadh and its 2 consulates in Jeddah and Tehran, after they were closed last week for security reasons and anticipated threats of attacks before the explosion at the complex in Riyadh, which killed 17 people and injured 220 others. On to the Palestinian issue. The Israeli occupation authorities reduced their security measures in the Palestinian territories. Meanwhile, the Israeli government announced that success of the meeting between the Israeli and Palestinian prime ministers depends on Abu Allah's plans and his responses to Israel's concerns about what they call Palestinian terrorism. The opposition within Israel is increasing, whereas 4 former directors of the Internal Security Agency warned of a catastrophe if they continue to occupy the Palestinian territories.
This is another Palestinian-Israeli attempt to reach a truce and resume implementing the roadmap. Israel is preparing for the meeting between Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and his Palestinian counterpart, Ahmed Kuria. The meeting is scheduled to take place after Sharon returns from Italy next week. Occupation forces reduced their security measures on the crossings to areas under the Palestinian Authority, deploying Arabic-speaking reservist soldiers to the checkpoints. Meanwhile, there are voices in Tel Aviv urging Sharon's government to give Ahmed Kuria a chance and not to repeat the situation with his predecessor, Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen. Both the Palestinian and Israeli sides are demanding a lot from the meeting between Sharon and Kuria. Things may not be achieved due to a lack of trust and failed past experiences. Israel preempted the meeting by playing its old tune, requiring that Palestinian Prime Minister Ahmed Kuria put down the Palestinian resistance.
Mr. Abu Ala actually must come to us with a clear plan and a response to a question that was asked in the past. How will he fight Palestinian terrorism? If he does so, then we will do everything in our power to help him achieve progress. Our aim is to end the violence and maybe begin with the roadmap in order to achieve peace.
Sharon's government does not want to claim responsibility for hindering peace efforts, blaming the Palestinian side instead. Nevertheless, 4 former directors of Israel's internal security agency, the Shin Bet, are voicing an unprecedented warning, saying it will be a catastrophe for Israel if they continue occupying Palestinian territories, accusing the consecutive Israeli government in Tel Aviv of reaching a dead end with the peace process, and calling for immediately dismantling settlements.
Israeli Defense Minister Shaul Mufaz concluded a week-long visit to Washington, where he met with senior American officials. Mufaz asked the U.S. military for financial aid and tried to persuade the Americans on the importance of the separating wall for the security of Israel. Mufaz concluded his visit by finalizing a deal to send Israel advanced F-16 planes. Now to our reporter in Washington, Abdullah Al-Safin.
In the hallways of American policymakers, Mufaz discussed Israel's problems and not the Palestinians. The economic crisis threatens the occupation army's advanced training programs. Also, due to the Intifada, the number of people migrating from Israel exceeds the number of people immigrating to it. Mufaz asked Congress to allocate a portion of the U.S. defense budget to cover the U.S. military aid to Israel. Mufaz's agenda included finalizing military deals and obtaining financial aid. There are people in the Department of Defense who stand by the Likud government in Tel Aviv, while at the same time insisting on their extremist position towards Israel's arrogant military power, represented by Mufaz, who repeated his threats to Syria from Washington. However, observers are not surprised, and these are the reasons.
Israelis come to Washington a lot.
Israelis come to Washington a lot and conduct talks to develop joint ties. There are mutual interests, and they have been doing so for a long time. Their experience in this field has been successful.
Mufaz prepared for his visit by taking several measures, such as removing a few barriers which Israel used to separate the Palestinian territories with. He did so in order to save face.
If the Israeli government is serious about moving forward with the peace process, then there is a roadmap. The articles are clear, but I don't think that Sharon wants to implement the roadmap. He wants to discuss peace as an alternative to implementing the roadmap. Thus, talking about peace becomes an alternative to achieving peace.
The Bush administration does not give much attention to demonstrations like those which was organized to protest the racist apartheid wall. The most they require from Israel is that it shows a desire to negotiate with the Palestinians, while using measures of oppressing the Palestinians financially and psychologically. Using the military force as a political tool is the philosophy used by White House and Pentagon policymakers on the Middle East. This makes Mufaz's mission in Washington not only easy, but guaranteed.
The same routine repeats itself again and again. People are waiting for a new political formula with Ahmed Correa's new government, but it seems that he cannot deliver more than what his predecessor, Mahmoud Abbas, was able to deliver. Correa is also calling for more negotiations with the Hebrew state to bring about a new ceasefire and a new peace plan. While the new Palestinian government was discussing the broad lines for a new policy, the Israeli government continued the policy of expelling Palestinian activists. Today, the Israeli government expelled a leader of the Fatah movement from the West Bank to Gaza. Moreover, the Israeli army made more incursions into the refugee camps of Nablus and Tulkarm and demolished a number of homes. Our reporter Nasser al-Laham provided us with the following report from occupied Jerusalem.
Those who thought that peace could come as quickly as Korea established the new government were disappointed. Today, a quick peace was not achieved. Rather, the Israeli occupation forces invaded Tulkarem and its refugee camp with 40 tanks and military vehicles under the cover of heavy firing. They destroyed the home of Salim al-Bashiti in Khan Yunis, causing damages to many neighboring homes. When the occupation soldiers entered Al-Qasa area in Lebanon refugee camp in Rafah, 2 Palestinians were injured. Near the Netzarim settlement, Palestinian fighters launched 2 missiles on a settler's vehicle as it was passing through the area. Meanwhile, the new Palestinian government, led by Ahmed Korea, held its first meeting in Ramallah, condemning the Israeli apartheid policy of expelling Palestinian citizens to Gaza or abroad. The condemnation came in response to a decision made earlier by the occupation forces to expel the Palestinian prisoner Musharraf Badoura from Ofar prison to Gaza for 2 years. Badour, who is 26 years old from Jenin, was taken to the Erez checkpoint in Gaza with his eyes blindfolded and accompanied by the occupation forces. 2 days ago, Kamal Idris was also expelled to Gaza in the same way. Another 26 Palestinian prisoners are still waiting in Erez checkpoint for the Israeli Supreme Court to approve the decision of General Gabrielski to expel them to Gaza. In a press conference, the new Palestinian Prime Minister Ahmed Korea said that his government met for the first time in an attempt to outline the duties of each ministry, the chain of authority, and how decisions will be made. Korea said that the next meeting will include the security agencies, indicating that he will unite them. The Israeli Haaretz newspaper quoted the foreign minister of the occupation forces, Silvan Shalom, saying that Sharon will meet with Korea in the next 10 days. Thus we will wait for 10 more days. We shall wait and see.
Israeli Defense Forces detonated 3 out of 8 explosive devices which members of Hezbollah placed last night on the border of Lebanon and Syria near Al-Gajar village, thus creating a certain level of tension on the northern border. More details from our correspondent, Moni Faris.
After many attempts, the snipers of the defense forces finally managed to hit a number of explosive devices, detonating it without resulting in any injuries. Yesterday evening, one of the soldiers discovered 4 explosives during his military deployment in the area of the Hasbani River near the Ghajjar village on the northern border with Lebanon. He found 8 explosive devices on the border planted by members of the Hezbollah organization. The leadership of the northern area put their troops on the Israeli border with Lebanon on the highest alert status. Moni Faris, the village of Ghajjar on the northern border.
Now to the Canadian capital of Ottawa, where a Canadian citizen from Syrian origin, Meher Arar, speaks after the United States deported him to Syria in September of last year. He speaks for the first time about the hardship of being held at a Syrian prison, where he was detained for a year without being charged with anything. The U.S. immigration authorities had stopped Arar in New York, suspecting that he had links to terrorist organizations. On his way back to Canada from a vacation in Tunisia, he was stopped in New York. According to the Prime Minister of Canada, his transfer to Syria began from Canada by mistake. He was released from the Syrian prison last month.
battlefield was heating up in occupied Iraq. U.S. forces pressed on Friday with an air and ground offensive against suspected Iraqi fighters, while a series of attacks left at least 11 GIs wounded. The U.S. military said an American civilian working for the U.S. Army was killed and another wounded when assailants opened fire on them as they were traveling north of Baghdad. It added that a U.S. helicopter gunship crew killed 7 suspected militants allegedly preparing to fire rockets at a U.S. base in northern Iraq, and American troops already arrested scores of Iraqis as part of Operation Iron Hammer. Anti-U.S. attacks in occupied Iraq left another 11 U.S. soldiers injured since Thursday as American forces pursued their Operation Iron Hammer against Iraqi fighters. The GIs received their latest blow in Baghdad's northwestern neighborhood of Khadra on Friday when a roadside bomb blew up as U.S. soldiers attempted to defuse it. 3 Americans were injured. U.S. troops blocked the road for about an hour and used a loudspeaker to call on residents to help them capture those who planted the bomb. They handed leaflets to residents saying that whoever gave information about anti-occupation activists could receive an award of $10,000 US. Moreover, 3 U.S. soldiers were wounded in an attack Thursday evening in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul, where the American military arrested 78 loyalists of the former regime. Also, 5 U.S. soldiers were wounded Thursday in 3 separate attacks in Kirkuk, north of the Iraqi capital Baghdad, and Fallujah, west of the capital. In Tikrit, U.S. occupation troops have detained at least 6 Iraqis, including a policeman, suspected of involvement in attacks against U.S. helicopters, such as a Black Hawk believed to have been shot down in Saddam Hussein's hometown last week, and behind the downing of a U.S. Chinook helicopter in Fallujah. Wearing night vision scopes, the troops fanned out in 4 neighborhoods.
We were targeting individuals believed to be involved in the shooting down of U.S. aircraft helicopters.
Meanwhile, U.S. soldiers manned roadblocks near Musanna airport in Baghdad on Thursday, searching for weapons shortly after U.S. forces struck suspected targets in the Iraqi capital with mortars, artillery, and gunships. A military spokesman said U.S. forces attacked 3 sites across the city, including a building used by Iraqi fighters on Wednesday to attack American soldiers with rockets. The strikes were part of Operation Iron Hammer, a crackdown against fighters whose attacks on U.S. occupation forces in Baghdad have grown ever bolder in recent days. Lieutenant Colonel George Crivo told reporters that American artillery units fired 155mm howitzers against Iraqi fighters who had fired several mortar rounds in the direction of the Green Zone. The Green Zone is the U.S. occupation's term for a sealed-off security area that includes ousted Saddam Hussein's former presidential palace and other administrative buildings, which now serve as its headquarters. The deteriorating situation in occupied Iraq raised a state of diplomatic alert within the George W. Bush administration, suffering more than ever from a setback in its efforts for help in Iraq. U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld arrived in Japan Friday amid growing worries over Iraq, with Tokyo being reluctant to send troops to the battered country. And the U.S. administrator of occupied Iraq, Paul Bremer, is dispatched to the country to develop a quick strategy to accelerate the transfer to self-rule as early as 2004.
Distorting the results in occupied Iraq does not seem to help George W. Bush's administration in getting aid from allies, particularly after Turkey and many other countries balked at sending forces to Iraq. Despite his words Friday denying that the U.S.-led occupation forces in Iraq are, quote, not in trouble, U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld rushed to Japan and met Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi and other senior Japanese governmental officials who decided to postpone the dispatch of its troops to Iraq. Japan's decision came after Wednesday's bombing of the Italian unit headquarters in Nasiriyah that killed some 18 Italian soldiers. It was the place Japanese troops were expected to be based once sent. Tokyo, however, said it is still committed to sending troops, but would send a fact-finding mission first to ascertain what it calls security conditions. The Iraqi impasse increased American public pressure following mounting casualties there. This has coerced the Bush administration to search for a way to push forward the transfer of self-rule process. The United States last October rejected in a draft resolution presented to the Security Council Iraqis assume full governing powers before they adopt a constitution and hold elections, and Washington did not set a timetable for the handover of sovereignty, which could take years. Many unexpected and deadly events took place since then, and Bush needs to cut his losses.
We want the Iraqis to be more involved in the governance of their country. And so Ambassador Bremer, with my instructions, is going back to talk to the Governing Council to develop a strategy.
In this context, British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw visited the White House on Thursday and met U.S. officials. He later met with his American counterpart Colin Powell, who said that Iraq's self-rule is in the interest of the U.S. and its partners. French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin expressed his country's position that only a united international community can find a solution to the Iraqi situation, accusing the U.S. of using indiscriminate force there that will lead to more violence.
What we see happening today is that we are reaching the limits of a military approach based on security, and that what must follow now is the finding of a political and diplomatic solution. And that is finding this solution. The first condition for success is the unity of the international community. I have said it repeatedly throughout these long months. Although unfortunately I have not always been listened to, France has only been guided by one single objective all along this crisis, that is, allowing the emergence of a safer and more just world order.
Iran's Foreign Minister Kamal Karazi on Friday renewed Iran's willingness to agree to a tougher UN inspection of its nuclear sites. Iran's statement came less than a week before the IAEA's board is to study a report from its Director General Mohammad al-Baradei that says there is as yet no evidence Tehran is trying to produce a nuclear bomb. The report annoyed the United States, which seeks to have Iran's issue referred to the UN Security Council.
Iranian Foreign Minister Kamal Karazi met Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi in Tokyo on Friday to discuss Iran's nuclear program and a possible deal with Tokyo to develop the Azerbaijan oil field. Karazi again in Tokyo said Iran's nuclear program is for peaceful purposes and denied U.S. accusations that it has a secret weapons program.
We on our own accord decided to let in the inspectors. This is because we want to clarify the ambitious points. We have a strong desire for transparency. We want to offer much more cooperation than what the IEA is seeking.
Koizumi praised Iran's efforts over the past month. Japan has been encouraging Iran to allow the IAEA unfettered access to its facilities. It renewed this pressure after the United States publicly expressed its opposition to a Tokyo-Tehran deal to develop the Azerbaijan oil field, believed to be Iran's largest, with estimated reserves of 26 million barrels. With the United States pushing a hard line, Iran's representative to the IAEA, Ali Akbar Salehi, warned Thursday of an international crisis if the UN nuclear watchdog refers Tehran's atomic program to the UN Security Council. Salehi said Iran would not withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but there were steps it could take. Iran's announcement came after the United States berated the UN nuclear watchdog for this week's report, in which it praised Iran for cooperation and openness and said it had not found evidence of Iran's nuclear weapons program. John Bolton, U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, said in Washington that the IAEA conclusions flew in the face of established facts. In a text released by the State Department, he said that the report's assertion is simply impossible to believe. The UN nuclear watchdog rejected the U.S. accusations. IAEA spokesman said, quote, "We stand by the classified document that will be considered at next week's board meeting." But the United States kept up its insistence, however, it denied a rift with the UN nuclear watchdog. U.S. Deputy Spokesman Adam Early said Washington is going to study the IAEA report and to take action with the IAEA Board of Governors. The U.S.-IAEA dispute intensifies an emerging transatlantic row over how best to deal with Iran. The split became apparent Wednesday when Britain said the report should be dealt with calmly and diplomatically. Britain, France, and Germany have repeatedly urged dialogue with Iran. This puts the European countries on a coalition course with the United States, which, according to a Western diplomat, is unwilling to accept anything less than taking Iran to the Security Council.
Leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, says the United States is at pains to transform the political and cultural spectrum of Iran to deal a heavy blow to the Islamic establishment. The leader told hundreds of thousands of fasting worshippers who converged on Tehran's newly completed Imam Khomeini prayer ground on Friday, the vigilance of the Iranian people and officials will foil all American plots. As for recent remarks by U.S. officials on democracy in the region, the leader went on to say the enemy takes great pains to sow the seed of discord among revolutionary factions over the indisputable principles of the establishment, such as the Constitution, and promote permissiveness and indifference to ethics among the youths. Today, anyone who takes measures which may widen the scientific gap between Iran and the developed world, or interrupts efforts by the three branches of government to serve the public, promotes American viewpoints in newspapers and public gatherings, and/or anyone who contributes to the war of nerves the enemy has waged against the Islamic establishment, is actually serving U.S. interests. As for the next Friday, which marks World Quds Day, the leader said the Palestinian Intifada has brought the Zionist regime to its knees, and that Muslims around the world will turn out in force for rallies on the last Friday of the holy month of Ramadan to throw their weight behind the Palestinian cause and tell the enemy Muslims will never let the question of Palestine drift into oblivion. Mosques, shrines, and other religious centers in Iran were host on Friday to large crowds of faithful Muslims who kept an overnight vigil, reciting Quran, saying prayers, and praying for divine clemency. Ceremonies were held across the country to observe the first of the three-day Muslim occasions of Ba'ath nights and to cherish the memory of Imam Ali, the first Shiite Imam who was hit on the head with a deadly sword strike while saying prayers on such a night. In the occupied Iraq, Shiites gathered in their thousands at the holy shrines of Imam Ali in Najaf and Imam Hussein in Karbala to take part in mourning functions and prayers. The Voice of America, VOA, announced on Friday the White House did not find convincing a report released by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which says Iran's nuclear program is geared for civilian purposes. Meanwhile, in a repetition of its allegations, the U.S. State Department accused Iran of trying to have access to nuclear arms, despite what the IAEA report says in that regard. The vice spokesman for the U.S. Secretary of State, Adam Early, said on Friday, Washington is consulting the IAEA governing board over the nuclear watchdog's recent report on Iran. Elsewhere, White House National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice reiterated the Monday report by the IAEA chief Mohammad El-Baradei on Iran's non-military nuclear program has not made U.S. abandon its claims on Iran. She added, given Iran's track record of secrecy, the international community should keep up the pressure. According to an AFP report, the British media quoted U.S. President George W. Bush as saying that military attack cannot be of much effect in settling the age-old problems between Iran and the United States.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.